I think the fintech startup community in Australia, whilst still quite young, it's growing really quickly. And I think what is really nice about it as well is that there is a community that's really willing to come together and back each other, but also very strongly opinionated and really quite keen to work with the government and a lot of other parts of the ecosystem to really create a really favourable environment for fintech. We've got a lot of support from the government, a lot of support from the regulators in Australia, and there's a lot of momentum behind this industry. The National Innovation and Science Agenda that Malcolm Turnbull, the Prime Minister of Australia, launched this time last year has really seen developments in the attention that's been put towards the startup community in Australia more broadly. And given that fintech is the largest of those startup subsectors in Australia, it represents around about 11 or 12% of all startups in Australia. We have been seen, or the fintech industry has certainly been seen as the vanguard of the startup community there. So there's a lot of time, a lot of attention, a lot of funding from the government and support toward really helping to develop the fintech ecosystem in Australia, which startups are really trying to take advantage of. What's really interesting with the Australian fintech startup industry is that, like a lot of other startup communities in the world, they tend to focus in on areas that are underserved by the banks. A really big one in Australia has actually been the complete absence of support for small business lending. So we've seen a lot of really great fintech startups targeting the small business community, and that's actually really taken off. I think Australia was actually the fastest market to hit 250 million in alternative finance loans in the world. But we've got businesses like SpotCap, Moola, RateSetter, Society One, who have really stepped into the space to offer small business lending solutions through fintech to the community. So that side has really exploded, and both from a business lending standpoint as well as a mortgage lending standpoint, we've got around about 25% of the fintech startup market in Australia focused on the lending category. That's the other really unique part about the Australian fintech landscape, I think. When you look across the world, usually the two areas that tend to be targeted by the fintech community first is that aforementioned lending sector. The other one tends to be in payments. And we do have a strong payments landscape in Australia, though that's actually one where the banks have had a very strong stranglehold. So we haven't seen as much of a proliferation in payments yet. About 7% of the fintech startups are focused there. But what we are seeing is really interesting development of some really strong digital advice players. And I think that's because the wealth management industry in Australia is extremely mature. Australia has the 5th largest pension or superannuation asset pool in the world, which for a country with only 25 million people is really quite remarkable. And it's quite well recognised that the wealth industry in Australia is probably one of the most mature globally. And we're actually seeing that some of the regulation or policy around how Australians manage superannuation is actually starting to be adopted in other markets as well. So we've got a really deep and rich pension wealth management sector. There's a lot of really great talent that's actually in that sector that is now actually starting to consolidate in Australia, which means that a lot of that talent, that really experienced high quality talent, is starting to actually now step into the fintech industry. So we've got players like SixPark, like StockSpot, as well as Clover, who have launched fintech businesses focusing on robo-advice and are doing very, very well. FinTech Australia's vision is to make Australia one of the leading markets for fintech innovation and investment. So we've spent a lot of the last 12 months really helping to understand what the industry looks like, what its composition is, what our natural strengths are, and how we can actually then champion that publicly overseas. So we can hopefully be attracting inward investment, but also helping our startups to actually get that awareness outside of our borders. We've been working a lot on making the policy and the regulatory environment in Australia a lot better, and that work is certainly going to continue in the next 12 months. But what we're also starting to actually do, which is part of the reason I'm actually here in Hong Kong, is to start to build some links with other associations and other regulators and other key players in the markets surrounding us immediately. So key markets like Hong Kong, like Singapore, really starting to drive that connectivity between the region. And we're here actually at the moment starting to talk to some of the other associations in the region about the potential of creating some kind of a federation together. Because I think there's a lot of room for us to be sharing a lot of information and learnings about each other's markets to help the fintech startups within each of those communities when they're actually planning to expand beyond their own borders into some of these neighbouring markets. So if they can actually get that head start to say, well, this is what the regulation is like in that market, this is what I would need to do, and here's some contacts that I immediately have to actually help me get set up on the ground, I think that'll really do a lot to help accelerate the growth and maturity of fintech in the region.